Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all.
All we need to honor our mother, share existence, all to existence. God's help will come from above, but first we need the love.
Welcome to another week of The Y Factor. Today's the 21st of April. I'm Miran.
And this is Tasnim.
And this is one of our only weeks of holidays throughout the semester.
So we thought we'd actually spice up the episode with some very interesting segments this week, inshallah.
You all like food, don't you? Who doesn't like food? So today we'll be having a little bit of an interesting focus on that in our main feature, inshallah. But before we do that, let's start with news.
The Y Factor.
Before we get to our local stories this week, let's have a look at the international news. As we've been mentioning on pretty much all of our episodes since this program began, there's been a lot of conflict occurring in the Middle East, and it's only progressing.
That's right. This week, Yemen is actually, the violence there is escalating. This morning, 4 were reported dead and 100 were actually injured. And the Security Council had a meeting to see what's going to happen in regards to this, to see if they can pass a resolution. But this morning, unfortunately, they haven't actually reached a consensus on what to do. But the violence is actually, getting pretty horrible there.
I don't think Yemen's actually received as much media focus and coverage as countries like Libya, Egypt and Tunisia have, for example. And if you're wondering, Gaddafi's still there in Libya.
That's right. I think the thing is, with the Security Council issuing, decrees, people are pretty wary at the moment, especially after what's happening in Libya. So, this whole thing, is a Western intervention? Is it warranted? So I think, there's a lot more hesitancy now with Yemen.
Yeah, but the one country that's really rising on the scene is Syria, where they've been protesting for about a week and a half or a fortnight now. Yesterday, actually, the Syrian government lifted the country's 50-year state of emergency. But even though they've done that, the protests continue, even though the repeal of emergency laws was one of the key demands. Now, under emergency laws, they actually weren't allowed to protest. By lifting the ban, they kind of are allowed to protest, but that hasn't stopped the Syrian government cracking down, because we've got video footage, going around saying that the western city of Homs has been, there's open fire from security on the protesters.
And not just that, it's actually caused a lot of deaths, and it seems that the families of the martyrs are actually organising these protests and things, and there's a lot of, heat in Syria at the moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of the protests actually stem from the funerals of those martyrs.
That's right, because, I think the president, Bashar, is probably the only one that seems to be actually getting there, speaking in dialogue, engaging with the country. Like, Yemen, he's just waiting for Saudi Arabia to do something about it, Gaddafi, and he's under my umbrella, press releases. So it's really interesting what will happen in Syria.
I think what interests me the most about Syria is that Bashar al-Assad, he actually has a massive support base. Like, I did not realise this until the protests began, but there are actually a lot of people in Syria who, don't see any reason for the protests and who back him up. Mm-hmm. And just as many people, or maybe even less, there's no real estimate of how many people support him and who are anti him, but there are also that many people out there protesting. So,
well, speaking of supporting, in the conflicts in Africa have actually been escalating too. We spoke a couple of weeks ago about the Ivory Coast. Nigeria just had elections, and just post-elections there's been a lot of conflict, causing 17,000 to actually flee their homes.
Wow.
Which is quite tragic, to be honest, and there has been a lot of deaths in that region, and it just seems like it's just getting out of control.
Yeah, I guess the whole Africa, Middle East area is one big major crisis zone these days.
The Y Factor.
And to local news, a quick note to Mohammed and all those supporters of shooting out there.
And hunting, according to him.
Premier Barry O'Farrell has come out and said that shooting in national parks that, the Shooters Party we mentioned last week was pushing for will not be going ahead. But nevertheless, the Shooters Party and the Christian Democrats still hold the balance of power in the upper house, where Mr. O'Farrell will definitely be needing their support throughout his term.
The Y Factor.
One of the most interesting and controversial news stories making the rounds this week is the issue of Marrickville Council and its, proposed boycott of Israel. Now, it's interesting because the proposed boycott was actually slammed by, it was voted against by Marrickville Council on Tuesday night.
Yeah. They've pretty much cancelled and scrapped the whole idea. Now, it's called like the BDS. It's been proposed since last year, and there have been complaints in Marrickville ever since. There's been the New South Wales Jewish Board complaining. plenty of residents of Marrickville have been against it, and they kept threatening to sort of vote out the current council of Marrickville at the elections. But hey, they didn't.
I think the main problem with this is the actual high amount of taxpayers' money that might have been involved. But the interesting thing is that Burma, like Marrickville Council, has actually conducted a successful boycott of Burma due to its human rights abuses for the past 13 years, right? That hasn't caused, any strain on our economy or on our taxpayers' money. But it's really interesting when Israel and that side of the debate weighs in. And I think Anthony Lowenstein had something interesting to say about this.
Yeah, Anthony Lowenstein, he's a Jewish blogger and a pro-Palestinian rights activist. Now, he actually wrote an article in Crikey last week saying that whenever these discussions about Israel or anything relating to Arabs happens in the news, no one ever thinks really to go to the Arabs and ask them, where are the Arab voices in the media? That was pretty much the title of his article. And he was saying that on this topic of the boycott of Israel, you've got Jewish people saying, why they think it should go ahead. You've got pro-Palestinian supporters who are not Arab or Muslim up there saying, why they support Palestine. But nowhere in all of this did a prominent or even a non-prominent Arab speaker come out and comment.
I think that's interesting because it's two ways. Number one is, as I think what Anthony was trying to say, is that they're not being asked. So, for example, why didn't SMH interview a prominent,
because
Arab activist?
In his article, he was saying even during the Iraq war, the SMH ran a story and he asked them, why didn't you speak to an Iraqi? And they were like, oh, we didn't think of it.
Yeah. And the other side is the complacency from our community, whether, being non-Muslim or not. It's a very, heated Arab issue. And basically, there hasn't been that much comment on this.
Do you know, I don't think it's complacency as much. I think we're all guilty of this same thing where we have an issue with it. We'll sit and we'll discuss it and we'll, have our heated debates amongst each other. But we never actually
vocalize.
We don't send letters to the editors. We don't, we don't make it known to the public. But Tasnim, what do you think of the actual concept of a council deciding to take a stance against a country? Because I know that's one thing that was being criticised in the media. The politicians. Yeah,
Barry O'Farrell came out and he goes, stick to the 4 R's. What was it? Rubbish, rates and roads. He goes, what's a council doing? Taking a stance on international issues when you guys are
someone was saying that they're trying to take over the Foreign Affairs Ministry's job, basically. Like, why are you interfering in foreign affairs of Australia? But what do you think?
To be honest, I think, it's a matter of principle, right? Like, obviously, local councils are there to give us the services we need, such as roads, rubbish, and, rates. But at the same time, there is no problem with grassroots action. And that's how it all starts. Like, for example, if we have take South Africa as a case study, a lot of the universities, a lot of the councils in South Africa have actually started grassroots boycott Israeli movements, okay? And they're gaining momentum. The unions kicked in. And when people have awareness, okay, it creates change, okay? So from one side, I think, fair enough, council should stick to what they're doing. But from another side, you can see success stories. And as I mentioned earlier, Burma has been boycotted for 13 years. It hasn't caused a strain on our economy or on, Marrickville Council doing that. Yeah. So if they do their job properly, locally.
See, that's a fair point. But I didn't actually know about the Burma boycott until you mentioned it on the show today. But before you did mention that, I was thinking, if you were to play devil's advocate, you can see where they're coming from when they say, why would a council do
Definitely,
that?
Because it's outside the ambit of their power.
Exactly, it's not really their role. But firstly, for them to have passed something like that, obviously they do have some kind of a support base.
That's right.
There are plenty of supporters of this boycott. And secondly, if they've been doing it for Burma, like you said, for all these years, then I guess it's not something completely new.
That's right.
So
even the BDS movement itself, it started off as, a whack idea. Yeah. And I know with the Muslim community, every time, Gaza is under attack, my mom and all her friends come get out there, no more Coke, no more anything, Max Brenner stuff, all these, Israeli franchises and stuff. Mm. And then they kind of, lose momentum. Or I remember when the issue was happening with the cartoons, so like boycott Danish goods and stuff like that. Yes. But the problem is it's sporadic. But with this, the BDS movement, it's actually a consistent effort. And because it's grassroots, it can change perceptions. Mm. So this is a sticky issue. Our listeners out there, tell us what you think. Like, do you think it's the council's job to participate in international issues, or should they stick to the 3 R's?
And do you actually boycott Israeli goods yourself?
That's right.
The Why Factor.
Well, speaking of Palestine and Israel, the violence in Gaza has actually been escalating. Now, around 2 weeks ago, this is when it hasn't started 2 weeks ago, but basically there were attacks by so-called Hamas on Israel, and then they kind of assaulted retaliations and things like that. But the violence escalated this week due to the death of
Vittorio Arrigoni. I hope I pronounced that correctly, but he was an Italian activist in Palestine who was working very hard, to get their basically try and help them with the whole human rights thing and try and get their voices across. He was also involved with the Mavi Mara flotilla.
That's right.
And I mean, the way he died was just tragic. Like, someone who was so helpful to the Palestinians, like, people were mourning him across the Middle East. They had candlelight vigils in Egypt, in Gaza, across the world, basically.
Well, he was actually, for our audience, he was actually kidnapped, and no group has actually taken official, claim on who it was, but there are statements by some Salafist Al-Qaeda leanings in Gaza who have issued a statement saying that was us, and basically it was a video showing him, he was actually bleeding and things like that, and then the next day they found his body in a house.
Why would they do that?
Now the interesting thing is Hamas has come out and said, okay, we're going to catch who abducted him. So they've actually found 3 suspects, and this morning this has caused riots, the pro-suspects, and it's actually caused a lot of strain in Gaza at the moment, with Hamas trying to find who the kidnappers were and causing tensions within Gaza.
Do you know, it really makes me stop and think, like, all these people who do actually give up their lives and their safety just to go to Gaza and help out, like, and they're not even Palestinian, they're not Arab.
The most interesting thing is his mum, Victoria's mum, said she will be on the next flight to Gaza. Wow. Like, imagine your son, being killed
because of this cause, and now you're going to go and take up his
and
role.
Honestly, you know what, it's this is not a Muslim problem, a Muslim issue. Christians are actually denied access to holy places during Easter.
Palestinian Christians,
that's
they're not
right,
allowed to cross to their churches and
this is causing a lot of tension because Easter's coming up. And not just that, just last night a couple of Palestinian families in Jerusalem received eviction notices from settlers, and that's causing a lot of problems. So subhanAllah, this area is under a lot of tension at the moment.
Yeah, you know what, it's honestly, like you said, it's not a Muslim problem. This is a human rights problem, and anybody who cares about human rights should be concerned about what's happening to the Palestinians.
That's right. But I think our audience out there, if you have any comments, like, what can you do, what do you think you can do as a person to help with this cause, because it is a very, very sticky issue.
And it's not just a matter of donating every year,
That's right,
a sum of money. It's much more than money. So what ideas do you have? What do you think should be done? Let us know on our Facebook page, The Y Factor Radio Show.
The Y Factor.
Yet another saddening death. All you chocolate fans in the world are going to find this especially tragic, though.
Miran's been mourning all week.
Italian chocolate tycoon Pietro Ferrero actually died in an accident in South Africa. He was on a business trip and he died after falling off a bike. Now, this guy, he owns Nutella, he owns Kinder, like Kinder Surprise and all that kind of thing. And his dad was the richest man in Italy. They turned the whole Ferrero company into a global giant of confectionery.
Wow.
So this guy's now dead. The guy who brought us chocolate, Nutella.
Well, rest in peace, chocolate man.
The Y Factor.